During the Second World War, the Nazi regime not only deployed armies, built camps, or committed large-scale crimes. It also left behind a network of hidden installations, buried depots, secret laboratories, and structures designed for purposes that are still not fully understood. These places do not appear on conventional military maps, but they were built with precise plans, state resources, and thousands of forced laborers. Some of these works were found by Allied troops. Others remain buried, sealed, or empty. Sources include released archives, soldiers' testimonies, and recent archaeological findings. They were not myths, they were real. In mines, tunnels, basements, and laboratories, the regime attempted to hide weapons, money, works of art, and scientific secrets. In many cases, what was discovered did not match what was expected. Some sites seemed prepared for something that was never used. Others revealed broader plans of control and looting. Everything was part of a more complex structure that survived the collapse of the front. What were truly the most impactful Nazi findings that came to light? And what secrets do those that have not yet been opened still guard? In an isolated area in the north of the country, on the Baltic Sea coast, the regime established a special base. It was called Peenemünde. There were no trenches there, no marching soldiers, no columns of tanks, only hangars, wide fields, and grey buildings where engineers worked. Their goal was to manufacture a type of weapon that would not need pilots, rockets capable of flying alone and reaching enemy cities. It was not a laboratory idea. There were concrete plans, ready parts, testing equipment, and goals imposed by the command. The model was known as V2. Test launches were carried out from the base itself. Trajectories were measured, failures were recorded, components were changed. There were rooms with cameras, fuel areas, technical instruments, and entire groups dedicated to controlling each attempt. Some rockets worked well, others crashed, but all data was saved. Those in charge of the project worked in a hurry. They knew it was not a game. A war was underway. Among them was Werner von Braun, who years later would use his experience in another country and for different purposes. When the Allied advance became evident, part of the production was moved underground. Even so, Peenemünde continued to operate as the main center. From there came the first rockets launched over London. They were not precise, but they were fast, could not be intercepted, and caused damage. In 1943, the base was bombed, several buildings were destroyed, but the work did not stop completely. At the end of the conflict, American troops took the place. They found parts, schematics, half-assembled engines. They took what they could, also the team. Many ended up in the United States outside the war context. Today, the site is preserved as a museum. There are sections where rocket parts, technical drawings, maps and photos are displayed. Everything indicates that the focus there was not on defense, but on impact. The V2 did not change the course of the war, but it showed that technology could go further. It was a sign that what was built as a weapon could have another use later on. And although the use was military, its origin remains marked in that coastal area among concrete, empty hangars and structures that still stand. In other more closed facilities where projectiles and the noise of the front did not reach, another plan was executed, less visible, but equally calculated. The Lebensborn program was created by the regime to ensure the birth and upbringing of children who met certain requirements. Maternity homes were opened in different parts of the country. Unmarried women who, according to the authorities, met the desired physical conditions were admitted: light hair, light eyes, good health. There they gave birth under medical supervision. It was not a common hospital, it was part of a system. Many times these women did not know what would happen to their children. Some were informed that they would be handed over to families linked to the party. Others had their children taken away without explanation. Babies taken from other countries also arrived. They were children kidnapped based on their appearance. They were raised as if they were German, with false names and no trace of their origin. What was offered as protection was actually a system of control over who should be born and how they should be raised. The decisions were not made by the mothers. They were made by those in charge of the program. When the war ended, the centers were abandoned. Documents were burned. Lists were erased. Thousands of those children grew up without knowing their origin. Over time, clues appeared: manipulated certificates, lost letters, fragments of records. Some mothers told what had happened. Some adults discovered that they were not who they thought they were, but many cases remained unresolved. In some buildings, remains can still be seen. Small beds, drawings on the walls, objects marked with initials. Nothing seems out of the ordinary, except for those who know what that place was. What was presented as a support network was actually a program to mold the population. It was not just about providing assistance. It was about deciding which births were useful and which were not. And although almost everything was destroyed, traces continue to appear. The Lebensborn program left no mass graves or bombs, but it left an entire generation marked by control, concealment, and decisions made from offices they never knew. While in those places the type of person who should be born was being decided, in other parts of the country, tunnels were being excavated tirelessly. In a mountainous area to the southwest, the regime pushed a project called RIES. It was not published in any newspaper, it was not announced on maps, but it mobilized thousands of forced laborers. Entrances were opened in the rock, corridors were drilled, ceilings were reinforced, rooms were connected, all under constant surveillance. The plans were incomplete. No one fully knew the final objective. Some spoke of a command center, others of a complex for manufacturing weapons, but it was never confirmed. Conditions were harsh: cold, dust, humidity. Work was done in shifts with basic tools. There were daily accidents. Deaths were not counted by names, only by numbers. Some areas were covered with cement, others were supported by damp wood. There was no natural light. There was no ventilation. The project continued to grow without public explanation, without a completion date. Each day more workers, more materials, more orders arrived. When the war ended, Allied troops found the accesses. There were half-finished structures, discarded equipment, loose documents. The tunnels were empty, but they showed that something important had been attempted there. They were never used. They were never completed. And to this day, no one has been able to say with certainty what they were for. Some entrances remain closed. Others can be visited. What is clear is that there was a clear intention to build something large, hidden, and durable. But the RIES project remained a network of galleries without a destination. An enormous effort buried in rock, without complete explanation, without final use. In the south of Germany, one of the lesser-known projects was the creation of reinforced shelters in mountainous areas where high-ranking officials were expected to withstand prolonged aerial attacks. Some of these structures were built on steep slopes, others in natural caverns adapted with concrete and steel reinforcements. They were not functioning military bases, but rather refuge spaces, designed for a war that was becoming increasingly defensive. The entrance to many of these sites still exists, although blocked by debris. One of the most striking cases was that of an underground shelter in Berchtesgaden, near the Kehlstein house. There, empty rooms were discovered, storage areas with canned food, unfinished technical zones, and ventilation outlets that connected to the forest. There were no signs that it had been used for a prolonged period. Everything seemed ready, but without having been occupied. These spaces reinforced the idea that the regime was preparing for prolonged resistance in isolated areas. But the speed of the Allied advance prevented them from being used. Abandoned medical facilities were also found that had been adapted to carry out tests on human beings without official records. The rooms were equipped with individual beds, surgical lamps, and cabinets with substances labeled only with numbers. Some walls showed restraint marks. In certain areas, trays with rusted surgical tools, broken glass containers, and loose notes were found. Although it was not possible to reconstruct exactly what was done in those rooms, everything indicates that they were used for unregistered medical practices. The discovery of these structures, far from the front and without direct military activity, showed how the regime had designed intermediate zones for logistical, experimental, or refuge purposes. They were not improvised facilities. They had plans, personnel, and assigned resources. But they remained incomplete, reflecting a machinery that failed to execute all its plans. What remained underground or behind sealed doors is further proof of the reach of a system that thought of everything, even its possible retreat. In the Sachsenhausen concentration camp on the outskirts of Berlin, a secret operation was organized with an economic objective: to manufacture large quantities of counterfeit money. The regime had decided that an effective way to strike the enemy was to destabilize their economy from within. For this, they set up a printing workshop inside the camp itself. It was not an improvised room. It had presses, special inks, metal plates, and stacks of carefully stored paper. All the equipment was chosen to precisely copy every British banknote. The assigned prisoners were typographers, engravers, or designers. Each one was selected for their skill, not for their ideas. They were kept separate, with strict shifts and constant surveillance. They slept in different barracks. They did not talk to each other. They did not know how many banknotes were produced per day. They only received instructions. If an exemplar came out wrong, it was repeated. If there were errors, the entire batch was discarded. Nobody could ask anything. The guards only wanted results. Week after week, stacks of counterfeit banknotes that looked original came out. The plan was called Operation Bernhard. The idea was to drop these fake banknotes over British territory or infiltrate them into banks through covert networks. Although not all the money came to be used, millions were produced. When the project was cancelled, the banknotes were transported and hidden in other places. But everything had begun there, in closed rooms inside a concentration camp, where prisoners were forced to copy every stroke with millimeter precision, without knowing if they would get out of that work alive. In another part of the country, to the south, one of the most protected complexes by the regime was installed. In Obersalzberg, a mountainous region with narrow roads and open views of the valley, dwellings, offices, warehouses, and structures for the political elite were erected. It was not a military center. It was a core from where decisions were made. Hitler lived there. Also others like Himmler, Bormann, or Göring, each with their own building. Everything was interconnected by private roads, permanent surveillance, and secure communication lines. One of the best-known buildings was the Kehlstein House. It was located on top of a mountain and was accessed by a road that spiraled upwards. At the end, a tunnel bored into the rock led to an elevator that ascended vertically into the interior of the building. There, the rooms were few, the windows large, and the furniture austere. It was not a house to live in. It was a point for brief meetings with very controlled visits. From there, the entire valley could be seen. There was no free access. Every entrance was guarded. When the Allies bombed the area in April of 1945, several buildings were damaged. The Berghof was one of the most affected. Upon the arrival of the troops, they found broken furniture, burned papers, marked maps, and empty rooms. It was ordered to dismantle a good part of the place to prevent it from becoming a site of homage. Only the Kehlstein House remained. Due to its location and structure, it was difficult to destroy. Today, it continues to function as a restaurant. It retains its shape. It is accessed by the same tunnel and the same elevator that were used then. That place showed how power is not always protected with weapons, but with distance, private routes, constant security, and access control. Obersalzberg was one of the centers where political command was attempted to be shielded while the rest of the country crumbled. Today, there is no official activity there, but the structures are still standing. They can be toured. Some corridors remain closed, others are open to the public. But what was organized there does not appear in tourist brochures. It is in the plans, in the archives, in the photos taken by those who arrived later. While the High Command lived protected in mountainous areas, others worked underground, without light or rest. In the Harz region, the regime ordered entire factories to be moved underground. Allied bombs had already destroyed many surface production centers. To continue manufacturing, tunnels were dug, machines were assembled, and everything was installed in underground galleries. Forced labor was used. Prisoners arrived from nearby camps. They worked with picks, shovels, and without protection. The dust, humidity, and heat made it impossible to breathe well. Rocket parts, tank parts, fuselages, and other elements to maintain the armed front were produced. There were no breaks. There were no names. Each worker was a number with a task. If he fainted, he was replaced. If he did not meet the quota, he did not eat. The dust covered everything. The humidity broke the wood. The lights went out without warning. The walls creaked. Some areas collapsed, sometimes with people inside. There were no emergency exits. If it collapsed, the tunnel was closed and another was opened. In April of 45, the Americans arrived. They found active machinery, loose tools, packed parts, incomplete documents, and unburied bodies. Some areas were mined, others half abandoned. Photos were taken, inventories were made, remains were collected. Some entrances were sealed due to danger, others remained exposed. Over time, the objects rusted, but the main structure remains. Some parts are open to the public. On certain walls, marks, engraved names, signs made with charcoal or metal can still be seen. What happened there was not an attempt. It was a real production chain, functioning underground, with prisoners who worked until they collapsed. It was not an experimental idea. It was an active factory. What came out of there was used, and what remains are humid tunnels, deformed structures, buried remains that still appear when someone excavates by mistake. What was intended to be kept away from the sky is still down there, as proof of what was manufactured without light, without air, and without return. In the east of the country, in a mining region near Merkez, Allied troops discovered one of the regime's largest financial hideouts. The information arrived through captured documents. It stated that a salt mine was being used as a warehouse. Upon arrival, the soldiers descended through the tunnels. What they found exceeded expectations. In reinforced chambers there were gold bars, stacks of banknotes, sacks of foreign coins, and valuables placed in sealed bags. There were also accounting documents, boxes with banking files, and materials with Reichsbank seals. Everything had been moved there weeks before, when cities began to fall. It was an emergency operation. They wanted to prevent the money from falling into enemy hands. That's why they removed it from the Reichsbank and hid it underground. They didn't just take funds. They also put furniture, carpets, paintings, sculptures, clocks, and pieces taken from museums or homes into that mine. There were boxes with books, suitcases with official seals and unlabeled packages. The air was thick. The walls dripped with moisture, but everything was intact. The inventory was slow. Every corner was photographed. Lists of quantities were made. A fleet of trucks was needed to remove everything. Many objects were taken to secure depots. Others were sent to laboratories to verify their origin. Some had engravings indicating they came from central banks of occupied countries. Others were marked with erased names. What could not be traced was filed as ownerless property. That find showed the final attempt to save the regime's financial base, even though there was no longer any way to sustain it. Not far from there, in a mountainous area of Austria, another discovery surprised with its cultural value. In Altaussee, inside an active salt mine, an enormous cache of artworks was found. The access was blocked with dynamite, ready to explode, but it was deactivated in time by local workers. When they entered, they found galleries full of paintings, sculptures, documents, and historical furniture. It was a collection assembled with pieces stolen over years. Many came from museums across Europe, others from private collections. The conditions inside the mine helped with preservation: stable temperature, controlled humidity, little exposure. The objects were packed, some wrapped in blankets, others in wooden boxes. There were handwritten labels. Artists' names could be read. Works by Vermeer, Rubens, Rembrandt. Everything was classified. It was planned that they would be part of the museum Hitler wanted to open in Linz. That's why that location was chosen. Secure, deep, and easy to seal in case of danger. Weeks were needed to empty the mine. What was found was documented piece by piece. Some works were returned to their countries, others remained stored, some were never claimed. No one expected to find so much art underground. Altaussee became a symbol of how the regime not only sought to dominate with weapons, but also with cultural symbols. What they hid there was not war material. It was looted heritage, chosen and carefully packed as part of an idea of total control. In another part of the country, near the city of Weimar, a network of tunnels built in haste during the final years of the conflict was discovered. The site was called Jonastal. The terrain was difficult: hard rocks, uneven ground, cold weather. Despite that, galleries, access ramps, and spacious areas reinforced with concrete were excavated. No one knew exactly what it was being built for. Some reports suggested it was a new headquarters. Others spoke of a facility for special tests. What they found did not clarify it entirely. The workers were prisoners. They came from nearby camps. They dug with basic tools. They were given no information, only orders. Passages were opened around the clock. The walls were covered with marks. Some areas had wiring half installed. Others were rough, unfinished. The galleries were long, dark, without ventilation. Collapses were common. Conditions were bad. Even so, work continued almost until the end. When the Allies arrived, the place was empty. Broken blueprints, open cement sacks, and unused machinery parts were found. There was no personnel, only incomplete structures without clear function. Jonastal remained as an example of the plans that were not carried out, a place without a defined end. To this day, there are theories about its use. Some entrances are sealed, others can be seen from outside. But no one has been able to confirm what was intended to be done there. The only certainty is that the effort invested was enormous. and the result invisible. What was built never became operational. Off the coast of northern France, there is a small group of islands belonging to the United Kingdom: Guernsey, Jersey, and Alderney. During the war, they were the only British territory occupied by the Nazis. There were no major battles there, but what was built left visible marks to this day. When the Germans took control in 1940, they began to erect fortifications. They wanted to turn these islands into a natural wall against a possible invasion from the sea. In a short time, the beaches were filled with structures. Tunnels were excavated, bunkers with thick concrete were erected, watchtowers were installed on cliffs, underground warehouses, shelters with ventilation systems, ammunition depots and machine gun nests covering every possible entrance. In Alderney, forced labor camps were built. Prisoners were forced to dig, load materials, and keep all sites operational. Barracks, storage areas, and zones for continuous surveillance were also installed. The workers were not soldiers. They came from occupied areas, detained without trial. They dug with old tools, without brakes, under constant surveillance. The weather was harsh. The terrain, rocky. Shifts did not stop even at night. The structures were solid. In many cases, the roofs were several meters thick. They were built to withstand direct impacts. Some had double entrances, reinforced doors, connections between defensive points, rooms with generators and radios. Each construction was designed to withstand prolonged attacks, although these attacks never came. Documents found later show that the objective was to convert each island into a closed stronghold. There were no major attacks. In May of 1945, the German soldiers surrendered without firing. The fortifications were not used, but they remained there. Some were sealed, others remained visible. Several are open to the public. Today you can explore tunnels, climb turrets, see observation towers, narrow corridors, and areas buried underground. In some parts there are still beds, remains of uniforms, rusted systems, and marks on the walls. The map of the time shows how each island was divided into defensive zones, with marked routes for moving soldiers, depots on hills, hidden emergency exits, and an internal communication network. Although not used in combat, these constructions show the regime's real fear of losing the channel. The islands were seen as key points. Everything was fortified to the maximum. Today, the archipelago has tourist routes and museums that show what was done. Some areas remain closed, others open only with permission. But what remained buried there remains an example of Nazi engineering designed for a defense that never occurred. In Frankfurt, one of the country's large cities, the Allies found something else. They were not tunnels, nor were they weapons. It was a trade. From the outside, it looked like any store. But inside there were shelves, clean display cases, labels, and a different type of inventory. Personal items were offered: glasses marked with initials, pens, lenses, watches, candelabras, necklaces, photos. They had no prices, but they did have codes written on paper. Upon reviewing the documents found there, everything was understood. These objects came from deportations. Every time a Jewish family was arrested, their belongings were separated. The useful ones were sent to classification centers. Then they arrived at places like this to be resold. It was not a loose looting. It was a chain with records. Each object passed through hands that cleaned it, put a label on it and stored it. Some bore engravings of their owners, others folded notes never read. Among the papers, letters, lists of properties and maps of marked houses were found. The smallest objects were placed on trays, jewelry in strong boxes. In the back there were entire suitcases, many unopened. When the Allies checked the site, they understood that these were not isolated robberies. It was a legalized network with permits, stamps, signatures, and assigned transports. What was found in Frankfurt was one of the few physical proofs that this operation included resale points, with stores open to the public. After the war, some tried to recover what was theirs, but almost nothing returned. Many had died. Others could not prove what belonged to them. The place was closed, the display cases emptied, but the story of that store remains an example of dispossession turned into business. The looting system was organized from above. It was not limited to luxury items. Cutlery, medical instruments, cheap watches, even kitchen utensils were sold. Each item was classified according to its utility. If it had personal engravings, they were covered. If it came with labels, they were replaced. The warehouses were organized by product type. In some display cases, family photos were placed next to the objects, as if nothing had happened. The store operated as if it were a legal market, although everything in it had been stolen under the protection of the state. In the south of the country, in rural areas of Bavaria, there were buildings that outwardly looked like normal hospitals or schools, but since 1939 several of them were adapted for a different purpose, to apply the euthanasia program that the regime had approved. These were not terminally ill patients. These were people with mental disabilities, chronic diseases, or conditions that did not represent a danger. Under this plan, they were secretly eliminated, without trial or notice, and with false causes registered in official papers. Those who arrived were examined by new doctors with spreadsheets. If they were not considered fit, they were separated. Some were given special food for a few days. Others were taken directly to closed rooms. Injections were used. In other cases, hidden gas systems were installed. Deaths were registered with false diagnoses. Families received urns with ashes, letters with neutral phrases, and no real explanation. They could not ask questions. Over time, buses began to arrive from other regions. More patients directly to the back wing. The procedure became faster. Names disappeared from the archives. Only figures remained. The staff continued with their tasks, some out of fear, others because it was their job. If someone doubted, they were replaced. Closed rooms were built. Medications were used in high doses. Incinerations were constant. The ashes were thrown into mass graves or with lime in the gardens. Everything was done without witnesses. It was not a concentration camp, but it operated with the same logic. When the Allies arrived, they found empty beds, incomplete files, and chemical remains. Some workers escaped. Others claimed to know nothing. Investigations counted thousands of deaths. It is estimated that there were more. Today, several of these buildings are still standing, some with informative plaques, others reused. But in many of them, no one lives or works anymore. Only the remains of a place where those who did not fit the model imposed from above were eliminated. The discoveries made after the fall of the Third Reich were neither exceptions nor isolated events. They were part of a structured system that operated within the internal legality of the regime, with public resources, direct orders, and coordinated participation of military, civil, and scientific authorities. Each installation found, whether tunnels, mines, laboratories, classification centers, or command shelters, responded to a logic that was not improvised. There were plans, chains of command, evacuation routes, lists of objects, standardized procedures, and internal controls. What was discovered did not arise by chance. It was designed to continue functioning even when the surface collapsed. The documentation found, the physical remains, the testimonies of those who worked at those sites or investigated them afterward, confirmed that these findings were only part of a larger structure. Some sites were abandoned unfinished. Others were dismantled halfway. Several still preserve marks, plans, and artifacts that have not been completely identified. The volume of what was found indicates that it was not about protecting a few assets or storing unimportant prototypes. It was about securing key elements of the system: gold, weaponry, science, culture, genetics, logistics, political power. Most of these places were built using forced labor in extreme conditions, with people who did not survive to tell what they saw. Access to many of those sites was sealed for decades, and although part of the material was recovered by the Allies or by subsequent governments, another part disappeared or remains unexplained. What is known comes from released archives, archaeological studies, and reports from military missions that inspected the occupied zones. More than 70 years after the end of the conflict, remains, broken plans, hidden galleries, and unregistered objects continue to appear. The discovery of each one not only provides new data, it also confirms that the true scale of the Nazi apparatus was greater than what was thought for years. These structures were not made to withstand a specific attack. They were designed to survive even after defeat. The question is not whether there are more. The question is how many sites like these remain buried, intact, and why they were never opened.